Last week, one of you mentioned Popeye. Now, I was raised on a steady diet of after-school cartoons and Saturday morning cartoons, and I am very familiar with Popeye. Now, is there anybody here who doesn't know anything about Popeye? Everybody does. So I looked him up this week, and I found out that Popeye is almost 100 years old. He was created in 1929, and he was in a comic strip in a newspaper. And his first line was, "Do you think I'm a cowboy?" And no, we don't think he's a cowboy. We know who he is. He's Popeye the Sailor Man. Toot toot, right? Everybody knows that Popeye is this strange-looking strong man. He has a squinty eye, and he has a pipe that he smokes, and he has a big chin, and he mumbles and grumbles and cusses, or at least he used to. And he punches the enemies, right? Bluto or Brutus or whoever it was. Popeye was sort of a superhero, and he was based on a real live person who was a boxer, who also had a squinty eye, smoked a pipe, and had a big chin. And he was also someone you would call the salt of the earth, a really great person who was dependable and loyal, a little rough around the edges, not very polished, not very educated, maybe didn't have a lot of manners, but somebody who had your back, somebody who would do anything for you. And this particular person was someone who loved children. Now, Popeye could be said to be the forerunner of the modern day superhero, because he would squeeze that can of spinach, right? And the spinach would shoot into his mouth, and all of a sudden he would grow muscles where he didn't have any before, and then he could do whatever thing he had to get done. He was empowered to do it. He was changed. He also, someone suggested to me, is one of the greatest philosophers of our day. Now, the jury is still out on that. But he did say a couple of things that I find pretty compelling, interesting things to think about, like, "I ain't no tailor, but I know what suits me." That's pretty good. He also said, "If I'm not me, who am I?" Now that's deep. You can think about that for a while. But the line that we all remember is, "I am what I am, and that's all that I am. I am Popeye, the Sailor Man," right? That's what we remember. Popeye knew exactly who he was, which is a little more than I can say for our disciples in our reading this morning. They didn't quite know what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. They didn't quite know what to do with it, and Jesus had to tell them. Now, we're reading today from Matthew's Gospel, and my professor from seminary, Dr. Ronald Allen, looked at this text and said, it's asking the disciples and us a couple of questions. Who are you, and what are you to do? Meaning, if we are Christians, if we are following Christ, if we are followers of Jesus, who does that make us? And what are we supposed to do now? What does that mean in our time and place? Now, in Matthew's time and place, it was really important to have those questions answered. Matthew was writing sometime, some scholars say maybe 50 to 60 is the year, so 20 or 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Some scholars today say he was writing much later, 80 or 90 CE. Didn't matter, because whenever he was writing, there was a lot of social tension. There was political tension. There was religious tension. There was a lot of upheaval happening. The Romans were occupying Jerusalem, so any time you could encounter an armed guard who could hurt you, and you had to be prepared for that. There was a political power grab going on. There was social upheaval. People didn't know how to be in that circumstance, and there was religious change. After the temple was destroyed, what did it mean to be Jewish? If you can't make a sacrifice at the temple, how do you continue to worship? And if you're a Christian, a follower of Jesus, you're still, like, you've got one foot in each camp. You're Jewish and you're Christian if you're in Jerusalem. And you don't know what Christianity is going to be yet. It's still a cult of Judaism. So in all of that tension, Matthew writes these words of Jesus. And I find it compelling because we are in the same kind of tension today. We have a lot of political upheaval. We have a lot of social unrest in our country. And we really don't know what the future holds for churches. Some are growing, but they're not actually making converts. They're just taking disgruntled Christians from other churches. Other churches are losing members. More and more people are questioning. They are saying, we're spiritual, but we're not religious. We don't feel welcome in a church. Or they're deconstructing, and they're asking just really difficult questions about things that we all accepted as beliefs a generation ago with no questions. By the way, I think that's fantastic. I love it when people are asking deep questions about religion and what we believe. But at that time, as at this time, it causes a lot of fear about the future of the church and the future of our nation. So Matthew is writing to an audience that is living in that same situation, only maybe a little bit more difficult than ours. And Jesus is telling the disciples who they are and what they are to do. Jesus has just given the Sermon on the Mount. Few lines before our reading today, he has told the disciples, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are you when you are persecuted. And then he begins to tell them that they are the salt and the light. Now, I think we've got the light part down. I think we all know what it means when we carry in the light of Christ and the candles are lit, and then after service, we carry the light of Christ out into the world. And all of us can say the words that we are to be the light of Christ, and we understand what that means. But how many of you walk out of here on a Sunday morning and say, I am the salt? None of us, because we don't really get what that means. What does it mean to be salt? Now, there are several definitions for salt that apply to this passage, so I'll give you a couple of them. One is that salt is essential for life. You can ask Google, and it will tell you that we don't live unless we have salt. Now, I know that some of you have heard from your doctors, no more salt. Listen to your doctor, please. But know that we have to have some salt or we do not live. So it is a necessity. It is essential for life. Salt is also useful. And in Jesus' day, it was precious and valuable because it was difficult to come by. But it is useful for preserving food. It's useful for seasoning food and bringing out the flavor. And it was also useful for cooking fires. And I love to share this because it will give you an image that might stay with you. Generally, children got to do this. They had to go out and find manure from the animals around them and mix it with salt, sort of like Play-Doh. If you've ever made homemade Play-Doh, it's full of salt. They would mix this Play-Doh with the manure and make a little patty, and then their mothers would use that patty to burn for their cooking fire. The kids got to do that. But salt was part of everyday life. So it is essential, it is useful, it was valuable and precious. And when Jesus tells the disciples they are salt, oh, it's such a compliment to them to hear that that is what they are. But there's one other definition of salt that we today might not know. Unless, of course, you went back and read Leviticus chapter 2 in the Hebrew Scriptures this week. Salt goes with the sacrifice. So when a Jewish person brought their sacrifice to the temple, the priest was, by law, required to sprinkle salt onto the sacrifice. Whether it was a grain sacrifice or a meat and animal sacrifice, it had to have salt on it. The salt was a symbol of the covenant that we made with God, that we are God's people and God is our God, right? And so the salt represented that covenant that stands forever with God. And the priest was required to add salt to the sacrifice. Now think about this for a moment. If Jesus is the sacrifice, the disciples are the salt. In the very next line of our reading, Jesus goes on and says, I haven't come to abolish the law. I have come to fulfill it. Even the law that says that there must be salt added to the sacrifice. If Jesus is the sacrifice, the disciples are the salt. He fulfills even that law. Now, Matthew is a masterful writer, and he includes this story on purpose so that people of his day, Jewish followers, would know what that salt meant. They would know, even though we probably don't know, that salt is an important part of the sacrifice. And the sacrifice is not acceptable if it doesn't have salt. So, we have this two-edged word that is given to the disciples, salt. Salt is a compliment, and it is also a call. So it's a compliment to these disciples to be called precious, essential, useful, valuable. Those are words we all need to hear. These disciples were a little bit like Popeye. They were a little rough around the edges. They weren't holy. They weren't rabbis. They were no one special. And to have Jesus say, "You are salt," that is a huge compliment for them. A compliment we all need to hear, that we are valuable, that we are precious, that we are useful, that our lives are not wasted, but we have purpose. But the second part of that word is a call to action, because salt transforms everything it comes into contact with. Salt pulls the flavor out of food, doesn't it? It preserves food. It melts ice. Everything that comes into contact with salt is transformed. And salt itself can be transformed. So when Jesus calls the disciples salt, he is telling them, you are useful and valuable and precious, and you will transform the world around you. Now, the disciples did transform. They transformed the world, and they transformed themselves. If we read in the book of Acts, we find out that Peter and James and John all were transformed. Instead of being these rough around the edges, uneducated fishermen and tax collectors and scribes, they end up leading the church. They end up preaching the words of Jesus, healing the sick. They completely transformed, and they transformed the world around them. Popeye also transformed. He isn't the same today as he was 97 years ago. In 1933, Popeye got a box in the mail. And when he opened the box, there was a baby in it. Wouldn't it be nice if babies just came in the mail? Postage stamps would never go up. The United States Postal Service would always be in business, right? There's a baby in the box, and Popeye takes the baby out, names the baby Sweet Pea, and adopts the child. He becomes a father. And as more and more children begin to enjoy this cartoon comic strip, Popeye stops cussing quite so much. He gets a little bit nicer. He doesn't mumble and grumble as much. And then, in 1970, Popeye stops punching Brutus, or Bluto, or whatever his name is, because it was not a good model for children. So Popeye begins to transform, and the characters in the comic strip also transform. One of them was called Alice the Goon. Does anybody remember Alice the Goon? I did not remember till I looked at a picture of her, and then I remembered. She was some kind of monster, but she transforms into Sweet Pea's babysitter. Now, I have some concerns when monsters become babysitters, but in cartoons, anything is possible. And with God, nothing is impossible. We can all be transformed, and we can transform the world around us. If we are the salt, if we are the precious and essential and valuable salt, we can transform ourselves and the world. So what I'd like you to think about today is, when have you transformed? Some of us can look back 5 years or 10 years. Some of us can look back 50 years. And I want you to notice and remember those times in your life when you made a shift, when something in you changed, when you questioned what you believed, or you questioned how these people over here were being treated differently than these people over here, and you decided to do something about it? When did you transform? Because folks, if you're not transforming, if your faith is the same as it was 30 years ago, I would have to ask you, is your salt still salty? Did you lose some saltiness? Is your salt now good for nothing than to be trampled underfoot? Because your salt should still be transforming you, transforming the world around you, and it should still be challenging you. So let's take a few moments and let's think about this statement. I am what I am, and I am salt. And I want you to imagine or go back in your memory and think about the times when your faith has changed, when it transformed you, so that when we leave this place, you will be ready to transform the world around you.